Hello, welcome to Glastonbury Romance Part Infinity at this point. I can't even keep up anymore. Let's begin. Mr. Crow! Mr. Crow! Came the voice of the Welshman, and John felt it incumbent upon him now really to turn his back upon Stonehenge. When he reached the car, John Crow was surprised at the urbanity and good temper of Mr. Owen Evans. He had expected that the man from South Wales, even if he didn't desert him, would reproach him vehemently. Nothing of the sort occurred. John got in and took his seat by the motorist's side, avoiding with some difficulty, for his legs were long and his foot extremely sore, the mechanism that worked the machine. "Are you going to stay away long in Glastonbury?" inquired Mr. Evans. John was perfectly frank with him in answer to this direct question. Indeed, in the entranced and relaxed condition of his nerves, he is more frank than he need have been before. He became, in fact, very voluble. He told him everything, only keeping back the existence of Mary and the existence of Tom Barter. By degrees, as he conversed with the man, while their car reached and passed the lighted streets of Westminster, he became conscious that Mr. Evans's questions and answers were composed of two levels of intensity, one below another. The upper, more superficial level was pedantic and a little patronizing, but the lower level struck John's mind as not merely humble and sad, but tragically humble and sad. One or two of his remarks were indeed as exciting to John's curiosity as they were stimulating to his sympathy. And another thing he noticed about the conversation of this man in the large bowler hat and the tight black overcoat was that it was always when the conversation returned to Glastonbury that the secondary tone came into his voice. "We'll get a late supper at Frome," Mr. Evans said at one point, and the idea of this heavenly refreshment spoke of lightly as a late supper so preoccupied John's thoughts that by degrees he contented himself with a drowsy attempt to learn the names of the villages through which they passed, and dropped all other conversation. They skirted the wall of Longleat Park. They passed Upper Whitebourne. They passed Corsley Heath. They passed Lane End and Garden Farm. And while still the memory of his mother was lulling him with a security beyond description, they entered the main streets of Frome. Mr. Evans seemed to know the place well, and having left their car in the yard of one of the smaller inns, the two men walked very slowly down the street. Most of the ordinary tea shops were shut, but they found at last a little refreshment place of a more modest kind, where they were given a cordial welcome and a substantial, though simple, supper in a small private room. During this meal, the strangely assorted pair had the first opportunity they had yet enjoyed to study each other's physiognomy under illuminated and relaxed conditions. John found that Mr. Evans had already heard rumors of the strange sequence of events by which the lay preacher Geard had inherited William Crow's money. Evans himself, he explained, had made the acquaintance of the Geards through the fact of Mrs. Geard being a member of a very ancient South Welsh family called the Rhys, R-H-Y-S. The motorist uttered the name Rhys with the most reverential respect. Not that Mr. Geard's immediate relatives, he made clear to John, were anything but quite simple people, but all the Rhys family were, as an ordinary person would put it, of the blood royal of Wales. It did not take any great diplomacy on the part of John Crow to lead the conversation up to the point where he learned the not unexpected fact that the maternal ancestors of Mr. Evans himself belonged to the same ancient house of Rhys. After a little further dalliance round and about the subject of the Geards, John found himself possessed of the further information that Mr. Owen Evans was an admirer of one Mrs. Geard's daughters, a girl in whom the very spirit of the old Cymric race had found a notable habitation. It was in his first manner, the pontifical one, that Owens Evans described this young lady. The foxy John had begun to wonder indeed whether his whole discovery of those two personalities in his patron were not a crazy fancy of his own, when a chance allusion to the Abbey ruins brought back in a minute that diffident, hesitant, almost cowering tone. It was a queer thing, and a thing that John never afterward forgot, as he saw a look of positively tragic suffering cross the strongly marked lineaments that he himself became extremely uncomfortable when this second tone of his friend's utterances thus predominated. It was exactly as if some bombastic masquerader in theatrical armor had suddenly unclasped his sham gorget and revealed a hair shirt stained with authentic blood. He got the impression, the longer this confidential talk over the felicitous Last Supper lasted, that it was to very few persons, and probably least of all to the maiden with the very spirit of the old ceramic race, that this singular descendant of the House of Ryes revealed his true, real nature. Once more, sitting by Mr. Evans in the late motor car and moving swiftly through the darkness, John's attention was distracted now by a certain vivid consciousness of being in a part of England completely new to him and heavy with unique qualities. After walking all day over the chalk uplands of Wiltshire, and long enchanted drive into the western valleys was like plunging into an ever-deepening wave of rich, sepia-brown, century-old leaf mold. From spinneys and copses and ancestral parks, as they drove between dim, moss-scented banks, a chilly sweetness that seemed wet with the life sap of millions of primrose buds came flowing over him. That sounds kind of nice. As both the men grew more and more dominated by the mountains and stirrings, the silent breathing and floating murmurs of a spring night in Somersetshire, they seemed to grow steadily more sympathetic to each other. "Do you believe, Mr. Evans, as so many people do," said John suddenly, in always struggling to find a meaning to life? Very slowly and very carefully did the Welshman reply to this. "It's not... It never has been in my nature," he murmured, to take life in that way at all. I find meaning everywhere. He hesitated for a long time here. "Difficulties," he went on, "are entirely personal." John was delighted with this reply. "My difficulties," he said, "are personal too. I simply cannot understand that people mean when they talk of life having a purpose. Life to me is simply the experience of living things, and most things I meet seem to me to be living things." In the darkness, John felt the car crossing a little bridge. "Nunnybrook," he heard Mr. Evans murmur. Soon they were moving along the southern wall of Asham Wood, and then came East Caremore and West Cranmore, and then the place called Dolting. "Look out for Shepton Mallet next," Mr. Evans said. "I'm afraid of the pubs all the pubs will be shut, or we'd stop for a drink there to nerve us up for the last lap of our journeys." His words were justified. It was plain that the inn bars in Shepton Mallet were fast closed. "We must put on speed now," said Mr. Evans, "or everybody will be fast asleep. They go to bed early in Glastonbury." John was soon conscious, as they left the last houses of this little Somersetshire town, solidly built houses under the gas lamps of the street corners with old carved inlets and worn buttresses, that the countryside was again changing in character. A faint, reedy, muddy, watery atmosphere visited his East Anglican nostrils. For a mile or two he was puzzled by these damp waftsures carried over upon the cold night air, so different from that leaf-mold sweetness, that smell of ancient signorial parklands through which they had recently passed. He experienced a pang of sadness which was easy enough to explain. It was 1,000 old impressions of Isle of Islay dykes, called up out of deep-buried race memories by the ditches, or rhymes, as they called them, of the Isle of Glastonbury. "I am getting near Mary," he thought. "She's lying in bed looking at those ruins." And then he thought, "Evans is going to get me a bed somewhere. He knows I've got no money. I'll see her tomorrow by hook or by crook, and then everything will work itself out." The thoughts of Mr. Evans, as he passed the hamlet of Pilton and crossed the White Lake River by a small stone bridge, were so absorbing that he instinctively began driving very slowly. Like all thoughts that had tormented a person's mind for many years, these thoughts had brushed and beaten themselves against the mental walls of habit until they had ceased to be thoughts and had become palpable images. The images in Mr. Evans's case were of a very peculiar nature, if they could have been revealed to any average human mind, a mind less vicious and depraved than John's, they would have presented themselves as something so monstrous as to be the creation of an insane person. This they certainly were not, unless all erotic aberrations are insane. And Mr. Evans, apart from these images, was, as John had discovered, a pathetically and even tediously guileless man. There were scenes of sadistic cruelty, these pictures that dwelt in the back chambers of Mr. Evans's mind. And the extraordinary thing about them was that, in spite of their iniquity, which was indeed abominable, they still produced in him, whether the last glimpse of them took form again, or whenever, an aberration of erotic excitement that made his pulses beat, his blood dance, his senses swoon, his knees knock together. The taste of the least of these loathsome scenes was so overpowering to him that it reduced all the rest of life, eating, drinking, working, playing, walking, talking, to tedious occurrences that had to be got through, but that were wanting entirely in the electric quiver of real excitement. What Mr. Evans suffered from was a fever of remorse such as cannot very often have taken possession of human minds in the long course of his history. To say that the unhappy man wishes that he had never been born would be to put his case mildly. Like Othello, he longed to bathe in steep-down gulfs of liquid fire. No one would ever know, unless Mr. Evans confessed to a priest, how many of these abominations had actually been practiced, how many of them described in forbidden books, or how many just simply invented by a perverted imagination. In the victim of Mr. Evans' perversions, supposing they really existed and were not phantoms of his imagination, had suffered cruelty, if they had, Mr. Evans himself had suffered, for the last 5 or 6 years, a torment to which human history can, we must hope, offer a few parallels. His nature was so riddled and saturated with this appalling habit of mind that it became a mania with him. Not that he had rejected all practice of it, and all pleasure from all thoughts of it, to blame himself for innumerable forms of suffering in the world of which he was entirely innocent. He walked about as if the ground under his feet was red-hot iron, so fearful was he of hurting so much as the tiniest beetle or the smallest worm. He used deliberately to walk across heavy grass and heavy undergrowth, so as to avoid the little half-made paths which always struck his imagination as things that had been hurt. Since a feeling of power, carried to a monstrous intensity, played such a role in his vice, it was natural enough that when, aghast at what he had become, he gave the whole thing up, he should labor under the delusion of being a much more powerful force in the world than he really was. Few modern persons, as intelligent as own Evans, believed as intensely as he did in the existence of a personal God. Perhaps there is something in the peculiar nature of his vice which especially lends itself to this belief. Recovering himself from his secret thoughts as they came nearer and nearer to the end of their journey, Mr. Evans murmured to his companions such words as "Havyot" and "Edgarly." He nodded his head, too, towards a great level expanse of low-lying country which extended southward to their left as they approached their destination. In connection with these dark fields, he uttered the syllables "Cannard Moor" and "Butt Moor." He further indicated that Ballinsborough and Kiernan Manville lay on their other side of these wide-stretching waterlogged pastures, at which John, in his blunt East Anglican way, declared in his country such places would have had names ending in ham, not in such finicking sounds as ville. He told Mr. Evans that Sex Mundham was a much more characteristic English name than Kenton Manville. As they approached the outskirts of the place, John became aware of the dim pyramidical form of Glastonbury Tor, towering over the walls and roofs of the town. The moment he caught sight of the great painted hill, with the massive deserted church tower on its summit, he felt conscious that here was something that suited his nature better than he expected anything to have done in these parts. Mr. Evans, speaking in his second manner, told him that it was the tower of St. Michael the Archangel. "I am glad," said John, "that St. Michael's tower was the first thing I saw here." But in his heart he thought, "To the devil with St. Michael. That tower is nothing but a tall pile of stones. I like that tower. I shall go up to that tower at the first chance. But Mr. Evans, in his tormented mind, cared nothing whether John liked the tower or not. He was crying like a lost spirit, "O cross of Christ! O cross of Christ! O cross of Christ!" Thus did these two, the man from Wales and the man from Norfolk, enter the silent streets of the town of Glastonbury. And they've finally arrived at Glastonbury. Oh, great. We finally made it on page 110 to Glastonbury. The titular Glastonbury of A Glastonbury Romance. So that ends the chapter Stonehenge. We got a new chapter for next time. I think I like this Owen Evans more than I like our protagonist here, John Crow, but unfortunately, I'm going to be stuck with that little shit for a long time. Well, until next time, cheers.